So as I was thinking this morning about that gospel reading that I just read, I get all the easy texts to preach on. Where is Cam when I need her? So let's try and make sense of this very difficult reading and very difficult scriptures that are before us this morning. And I want you to imagine what it would feel like if you had just found a new home, you'd found a wonderful house, and after 20 years, you were packing up your old home and you decided to throw some things away, but you kept all those wonderful pieces of furniture that have stories and emotional attachments to, and the photographs and your children's first clay pot that you've kept all these years, and you spent weeks putting all these carefully in boxes. And the movers come, and the van is outside, and they're busy loading the van, and you go through the house one more time just to check everything's okay. Then you go outside, and the moving van has burst into flames. Everything that you own is going up in flames, and you can't do anything about it. And this is a true story that happened to two friends of mine. They were between houses, and everything was in the moving van, and the moving van went up in flames. And it was obviously the fault of the moving company. Something happened. And insurance covered it. But for them, it was a crisis of faith. It was a kind of that their world had kind of come to an end, and they were on this kind of precipice, like saying, what is it that we value? What is it that's important to us? And they moved through that very difficult time. And it was literally a transformation through fire. That fire, it wasn't necessarily, they saw it as destructive. It was a fire that purified them for them to think about what was really important to them, what they valued most. And it was they valued that, actually what they valued wasn't destroyed. That their love, their health, their well-being, their relationships, their friends, their church community, all of that got them through this very difficult time. And I remember in a parish I served in California, St. George's, there was a Marine, a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps who was a very smart guy, single parent, very dedicated to his work. And he got a promotion, which meant that he was going to move to New Orleans. And so the congregation, we said goodbye to him. He was a very faithful member of St. George's, and off he went to do this. And it was around the time of the Iraq War. And he was a very, very courageous man of great integrity. He would go to the Pentagon, often banging on the desk, talking about our failed strategy in Iraq. He was very courageous. And he believed in transforming that society from the grassroots up, educating girls and women, investing in the community to rebuild the country. And so he just moved, and guess what happened? Katrina came in New Orleans, and everything he owned was in a metal container that was destroyed by water. And he said that the only thing that survived, there was a plastic tub of old photographs that survived, but everything he owned was destroyed. Transformation through water. And he, again, emerged from that as a man of faith. He said, these things aren't important. And it said, it allows me to focus on this big task that I have ahead of me. I have a big new responsibility. And that's where I need to put my focus. These are just things. And it was interesting, again, the parish really rallied around him. Not only was he a man of faith, but his faith community was there for him and raised money and supported him in prayer. And there was also a school in New Orleans that our headmaster had connections with. and the parish got behind that school. It was under 6 feet of water. And this idea of fire and water transforming things, transforming our lives, that's a part of this gospel story. It's about a positive transformation rather than a negative transformation. And it's about how we see these stories that are really about faith. Do we put our faith in things, or do we put our faith in the things that last forever? Jesus talks about watching where your treasure is, because that's where your heart is also. And it was clear in these two stories where the hearts and the intentions of this couple and this soldier was all about. And their communities responded magnificently to them. And it would have been very different if the community had not supported them. We would have been hypocrites. This word is used by Jesus in the gospel, and it's a very difficult word. We don't like to feel we're a hypocrite, or we don't like to feel that our faith community is hypocritical or our country is. We like to feel this congruity between what we believe and what we say and what we do. And the definition of hypocrisy is the behavior of people who do things that they tell other people not to do, behavior that does not agree with what someone claims to believe or feel, or a feigning to be what one is not or to believe what one does not, especially the false assumption of an appearance of virtue or religion. Before today's gospel reading, there is a very important verse in Luke's gospel. In chapter 12, Jesus talks about the yeast of the Pharisees, that is their hypocrisy. So the context of the word and this kind of condemnation of the crowd, you hypocrites, is in the context of a very important religious group that Jesus is singling out. So who were the Pharisees? They were one of 4 significant religious groups at the time of Jesus that were kind of fighting for power and for theology and for kind of dominating the culture. And about 100 years before the time of Jesus, they emerged as a kind of counter to the Sadducees, who were the aristocrats who ran the temple. They were the landowners. They were the people who controlled the government. And their whole system was built around temple sacrifice, the power of royalty, their connection to the Roman Empire. And the Pharisees were rather like the Protestant movement, where you have your own relationship with God. You don't need priests. You don't need a temple. You can have a relationship with God, and there's this huge investment in learning the Scriptures, interpreting the Scriptures differently. And so the Pharisees, 100 years before the time of Jesus, were creating this idea that you could worship God, you could have a relationship with God in your home. And so the idea of blessing a table, being hospitable, welcoming people, was already a part of this kind of counter movement to the Sadducees. Another movement was called the Essenes, the Essene community. And they were people who kind of feared that the apocalypse was going to come. The world was going to end very dramatically. And so the way they responded was to get out of Dodge. They moved out of New York to Millbrook. And they started farming and praying and waiting for God's great cataclysmic transformation through fire and brimstone. And we have lots of information about the Essenes. And basically, they were people that, it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket. It's only a matter of time, but in the meantime, we're going to stay pure and clean and wait for that transformation. So that was a competing movement with the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And in that context, Jesus and his movement is competing for minds and hearts. And his criticism of the Pharisees was that because they were kind of legalistic in much of their approach. It was very much, thou shalt not. The Sabbath, you weren't allowed to help people. He was criticized by the Pharisees for healing people on the Sabbath. And Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for us, not us for the Sabbath. And so there is a different interpretation of how we are to be in the world. The other part of this reading, this difficult reading, is we have to put it in the context of when it was written. And it says a lot about the competition for ideas and thoughts at the time. So we reckon that the Gospel of Luke was written in the last quarter of the first century. So say AD 90, it was written. So what happened is that in AD 70, the temple in Jerusalem was completely destroyed. And everything that was normal in terms of Jewish life was turned upside down. The Sadducees are not mentioned in this part of the gospel because they were obliterated. They had already disappeared from the scene. The ruling class, their lands had been seized, the parliament was destroyed, it was over. And it was interesting that the Pharisees when the temple is destroyed, guess what? All the temple traditions have been absorbed into domestic Jewish life. So you didn't need a temple to have a relationship with God. You didn't need priests in the temple to offer sacrifices. You could offer mercy and acts of goodwill. You could be hospitable in your home community and in your synagogue. So we owe a lot to the Pharisees for actually preserving much of the great ancient traditions of the Jewish community. And we also, as Christians, owe a lot to the most famous Pharisee, Saul of Tarsus, who translated all of those traditions into a way in which people around the world could understand how God loves them and how God is connecting with them in a whole new way. That first reading that John read from the book of the prophet Isaiah, it's about the image of what you take for granted, the vineyard, a place of abundance and blessing, where there is sweet wine, where there is fellowship, where there is enjoyment. All of that goes like the moving van going up in flames. And when people would have written this gospel, they would have seen Jerusalem go up in flames. They would have seen the destruction of the life that they knew and they took for granted. There is a very powerful account of the siege of Jerusalem. We often think about, the destruction of the temple. Okay, they knocked down a church. Too bad. It was much, much worse than that. This is an account from Josephus. And it puts in context, again, this whole idea of families that are in conflict with each other. This is the context in which that was written. Throughout the city, people were dying of hunger in large numbers and enduring unspeakable sufferings. In every house, the merest hint of food sparked violence, and close relatives fell to blows, snatching from one another the pitiful supports of life. No respect was paid even to the dying. The ruffians, the anti-Roman zealots, searched them in case there were concealed food somewhere in their clothes or just pretending to be near death. Gaping with hunger like mad dogs, lawless gangs went staggering and reeling through the streets, battering upon the doors like drunkards, and so bewildered that they broke into the same house 2 or 3 times in an hour. Need drove the starving to gnaw at anything. Refuge, which even animals would reject, was collected and turned into food. In the end, they were eating belts and shoes, and the leather stripped off their shields. Tufts of withered grass were devoured and sold in little bundles for 4 drachmas. So that gives you a kind of context in which people who wrote and would have read this gospel, it was within living memory, those experiences. There is a wonderful apocryphal story of one of the leading Pharisees who survives all this. And he's permitted by the Roman authorities to establish an academy on the coast near Joppa. His name is Yochanan Ben Sakai, and he was to emerge as the primary Pharisaic teacher. And there's a story that he goes to Jerusalem with a friend, and they're looking at the smoldering ruins of the temple. And this friend is lamenting and crying over this loss. And he quotes, the Pharisee teacher quotes the prophet Hosea. He says, "I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." And so this school becomes a central way in which Judaism as we know it kind of moved forward. And the Christian community also emerged from this time. And the letter to the Hebrews, that's part of our reading today, the letter to the Hebrews is probably one of the most beautiful, one of the most powerfully written testaments to this era. And the language, a lot of the symbolism, they use temple sacrificial symbolism. Jesus is the great high priest. The people of faith who have been through their own moving fires attest to this journey of faith that we're all on. And so the epistle to the Hebrews is this way in which people are trying to connect out of the destruction and the despair something that brings hope and love and power. So I want us to think about that in our own lives, about what we value, what is important to us, the power of community as we support each other on our journeys of faith, and that no matter what happens to us, that even the ways that God gets our attention in ways that we do not expect, that the community of faith will be with us and will rally around us in some of the stories that I shared with you. And that these moments through water, and it's interesting, the idea of baptism, the use of water, and the imagery of fire, which is also a symbol of spirit and baptism, that these are agents of transformation. And to trust that God is working that in our lives. And even when the really hard things happen that we do not expect, that we will find our inner strength within ourselves and within our faith community to get through it. Amen.